Okay, today let's begin at the beginning. That's right.
At.
Today we're going to talk about John Adams and his presidency. Let's do it. Okay, before we get into his presidency, let me just say that John Adams had an incredible life. It was a long one too. He was born in 1735 and died in 1826 on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, no less. Anyway, there are so many things to say about Adams, but here are just a few highlights. First, Adams was one of the most vocal and impassioned advocates for independence from Britain. And as such, he was a leader of the Continental Congress and a primary author of the Declaration of Independence. Second, he was one of the primary authors of the Massachusetts Constitution in 1780, and this was a big deal because it was the first constitution in the newly formed United States, and it set the pattern for the U.S. Constitution and included all those important principles like separation of powers. Third, Adams played a critical role in the diplomatic service in Europe during and after the Revolutionary War. For example, he helped negotiate the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which formally ended the Revolutionary War and set the borders of the United States. He also served as the first U.S. minister to Great Britain. Yeah, the United States sent a former revolutionary to go negotiate with the former imperial power. Talk about a bold move. But despite lingering hostilities between the two nations, Adams established formal diplomatic relations with Britain, also secured vital loans and commercial treaties with the Netherlands, which helped keep the fledgling United States afloat financially. Finally, before his presidency, Adams served 2 terms as vice president under George Washington. Now, he didn't seem to enjoy it much. He famously called it the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived. But he did help guide the new nation through some difficult times, like the Whiskey Rebellion. But what about his presidency? Well, it was a lot less smooth. First, let's talk about the good stuff. First, Adams managed to avoid a costly war with France. Now, remember, there were still some unresolved issues with France from the time period just prior to the American Revolution. And in 1798, there was an undeclared naval war with France called the Quasi-War. Tensions were high, and many in Adams's own party, the Federalists, known as the High Federalists, wanted Adams to go to war with France. They pressured him constantly, and they even lambasted him in the press. But Adams stood firm. He believed that going to war would be too costly and dangerous for the young United States. So instead, he sent a new peace commission to France, and ultimately the United States and France signed the Convention of 1800, also known as the Treaty of Mortefontaine. And this treaty avoided a full-scale war, and it remains one of the most significant achievements of Adams's presidency. Second, Adams strengthened the Navy, in anticipation of the possibility of a war with France. Adams authorized the creation of the Department of the Navy, and he expanded the U.S. Navy from 6 to 50 ships. Though that expansion didn't occur until later in the first term. It laid the foundation for the U.S. Navy that would become a major force in the 19th century. Third, Adams presided over the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing political parties in U.S. history. Despite the bitterly contested election of 1800, which he lost to Thomas Jefferson, Adams refused to let his personal feelings get in the way of the nation's interest. And he oversaw a smooth transition of power. And finally, Adams appointed a number of Federalist judges, including John Marshall as Chief Justice. These so-called midnight judges were controversial, but they did help to establish a strong and independent judiciary. Now that's the good stuff. What about the bad stuff? First, the Alien and Sedition Acts. These 4 laws passed by the Federalist-controlled Congress and signed by Adams severely restricted civil liberties. The Naturalization Act extended the residency requirement for citizenship from 5 to 14 years. The Alien Friends Act and the Alien Enemies Act allowed the president to deport non-citizens considered dangerous without due process. And the Sedition Act made it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government or its officials. Basically, these acts were a clear violation of the First Amendment, and they caused a huge backlash even outside of the Democratic-Republican Party. Second, Adams struggled to control his own party, especially the High Federalists loyal to Alexander Hamilton, who constantly undermined his policies from within his own cabinet. This internal strife crippled his administration. Third, Adams lacked charisma. He was not as beloved by the general public as Washington or Jefferson. His reserved and intellectual demeanor, combined with his sometimes abrasive personality, just didn't win him many fans. And fourth, those midnight judges. Well, they were controversial. Perhaps Adams's greatest failing was his inability to rise above partisanship and to see the office of the president as something greater than a mere extension of the Federalist Party. So remember this: when you're dealing with a new nation, it's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day politics and to forget the big picture. John Adams was a brilliant lawyer and statesman, but he was also a product of his time. And like all of us, he had his strengths and his weaknesses. That is all on John Adams. If you enjoyed the video, think about subscribing to hear more about presidents or just history in general. Thanks for watching.